Friends, I have uh, explained many aspects of journalism in my earlier videos. In this video, let me now get into the basics of news writing, the principles of news writing, and what kind of precautions you should take while writing the news. Because a journalist engagement is quite diverse in character. You may have to write interpretative stories, news analysis, backgrounders, features, news features, editorials, edit page articles, creative middles, etc. etc. So these are all different forms of journalistic writing. So we will try to discuss other aspects of journalistic writing in my next videos. But in this video, let me tell you the main aspects of news writing. Before going into the actual elements of news, what constitute news, what do you mean by a news value, and in fact, I will first talk about certain basic precautions. News is essentially the latest information. News cannot be something which happened in the past unless there is some update to it. Well, that's the reason why the 24-hour news television call their bulletins the news updates. So the news is always latest. How do you define the word latest? For a daily newspaper, the latest means what happened in the last 24 hours. In a television news, what the latest essentially is what happened in the last what happened between the last bulletin and this bulletin. For a web news portal, the word latest has obviously no meaning because everything a web news page publishes is latest. So it is extremely difficult to define the latest at a time when news is reaching the reader from various sources and with a tremendous speed. Today, in fact, I have received the news of the death of Nageshwar Reddy on WhatsApp much before the announcement has come. I really do not know whether it is a real news or fake news, but we got the news. Then I tried to ascertain. Well, everybody was telling it's true, but they are not officially announced. I don't know how. What do you mean by officially announcing even death? So we really don't know about it. But news was shared when I first got the message of Nageshwar Reddy's death late in the night around 11 o'clock. I immediately watched television news, but there was nothing like that. So I watched on the web, there was nothing like that. It was essentially the news about KCR visiting a 9E in the Apollo Hospital. So I have seen the web news portals and no way I have found the news about the death of former Minister Nageshwar Reddy. But the social media started sharing RIP messages also, condolence messages also. And I checked with this person who has sent me that WhatsApp message. He says that he got this message from a TRS source. So that is perhaps the reason why the person who has shared this message with me has believed it. So the point I am telling you is information, both news and not even news, are shared in social media. You have the web news, we have television bulletins, you have radio news, and whatnot. So the word latest varies from a platform to platform, but essentially news should be latest. So that's the first point. Second point is news should be fact-filled. Columbia Journalism Review says fact filled. What do you mean by fact filled? It should be filled with facts. The all kinds of facts should be it should be molded in the news item which you write. For example, you are writing about a happening. That's the reason you have the model called 5 W's and H, who says what, when, where, why, and how. But of course, in the age of internet journalism, the newspaper style of writing news has drastically changed. It is no longer a simple 5 W's and H approach. It's a very, very fundamental approach to writing news. Things are changing. The manner in which you write news is changing. You cannot still confine to this basic paradigm of news writing. But still, it is an important paradigm essentially because news should be fact-filled. So, let me again discuss this death of Nai Narasimha. Who Nai Narasimha? What died? Where in Apollo Hospital? Why he was suffering from the post-COVID complications? And how? So, and you talk about his profile, his life journey, etc., etc. So these questions, these 6 questions, who, what, when, where, why, and how, will help you to ensure that your story will be fact-filled, though you may not confine to this 5 W's and H approach of news writing. But still it is important because it gives you a checklist for including the basic facts of a news story. So the second important point is news should be fact-filled. So first one is it should have the latest update information. Number 2, it should be fact-filled. Number 3, do not write the news by sitting in your office. I have seen when I was an editor of an English daily, I have seen some reporters filing stories sitting in the office. Well, I caught some of them red-handed and sent them out also, because there is no meaning in writing news by sitting in the office. Obviously, a reporter is expected to visit the place, visit the field. So news should always be field-based information. Well, somebody may say, sir, I got the information from a reliable source. I spoke to that person on phone and I got a reliable news. So nothing can be more reliable than personally observing something. Nothing can be more reliable than personally experiencing something. Nothing can be more reliable than personally visiting a place where news occur. So never depend on someone. So always go there, always visit, always be a field-based journalist. Don't be a journalist who confines to the offices. And in the age of communication technology, this tendency to manufacture news sitting in the office or sitting at home has increased in the journalistic circles. So third aspect is news should be field-based. Don't depend on someone's version. Don't depend on grapevine. Don't depend on information shared on WhatsApp, shared on social media. Especially you should be extra cautious. These days social media certainly provide us with an important source of information. In fact, when I was an editor, I have appointed a social media reporter, a reporter who only looks at social media and files stories. Not that I don't believe in it, but you can't totally rely on it. Social media can be an immediate idea, immediate input, but that cannot be the final news product. So you may get a kind of a inkling of something happening by watching the social media or by using the information shared in social media. But social media is full of fake information. As an MIT study revealed, fake information travel much faster and much deeper. So there are vested interests operating in social media. So be careful. Don't try to create stories. Don't try to produce stories based on the information shared on social media. But however, social media will help you in two ways. A, to get an immediate input. So you check it. So it's like a crowdsourcing of information. Crowdsourcing is a very effective sourcing of information. So that's one advantage with social media. The second advantage with social media is, well, it helps you to understand what people are discussing. Well, you're not writing news for some awards. You are writing news to be consumed by readers. You are writing news to be consumed by the viewers. So you want your readers and viewers to consume news. So therefore, you should know what is being discussed, what is being debated, what is being read, what is being viewed. So social media can be an important agency to understand what is being talked about. So the talk of the town is seen in the social media. So carefully and cautiously use social media for news writing. That's the third. Fourth one is, news should always be objective. What do you mean by objective? I'm not trying to tell you neutrality. Well, ethical neutrality is a characteristic of a researcher. Ethical neutrality should also be a characteristic of a reporter. So he should not allow his prejudices, passions, opinions, biases to creep into news writing. So never do that. If you really want to do that, you can write an opinion piece. You have a freedom. That's the reason there's a popular saying in news journalism called facts are sacred, comment is free. So what do you mean by objectivity and fairness in reporting? You should always write both the versions. When you're writing about someone or something, ensure that you will also give the other view. Never confined to your own single source. I'll tell you an interesting experience of my own. So one newspaper, I don't know what's name, has published a story that I am contesting on some party candidate. Well, I was never and I will never be a party candidate. I was an MLC in 2007 and 2009 only as an independent candidate, and I will remain independent in future. But this reporter simply wrote that I am promoted, sponsored by a particular party. I don't know how did he get that information. I called up the editor and the reporter also. The reporter interestingly says he got the source from an adversary. The story says, let me openly tell you also, the story says that I will be the TRS supported candidate for the ensuing legislative council elections. So when I asked him, he said, sir, BJP sources told me. Is there any meaning in it? So how can he talk about TRS based on the BJP sources? How can he talk about BJP based on the TRS sources? Which is absolutely unprofessional way of writing news. So I have told, and my version is not given, surprisingly. He could have simply called me and asked, sir, is it true? So the story was published. I don't know whether it is a paid news or the fake news or is a product of an unprofessional journalism. I really don't know. But when I called up the editor and clarified, so the basic journalistic ethics demand that my version should also be given. I respect the freedom of expression. But the freedom of expression cannot be the victim of journalistic ignorance and unprofessional behavior of a journalist. So subsequently, a clarification is also published. Again, that I'm not a candidate of any party. If I will only be independent, I was an independent, I will be an independent. So the why I'm telling this is the basic principle of journalism is when you are writing about something, always give the other version. So that is fairness. Well, you have freedom to write, but that is the fairness demand that the other version should be given. When you are writing a piece critical of BJP, so you should give the BJP version also. If you are writing, if your story is about the TRS government failure in handling the flood situation, make sure that you also quote the official source, a minister or a government official. So you can't quote only opposition sources and write on the flood, how the floods were managed in Hyderabad. So that is called fairness and objectivity. Then the fifth point is attribution, quotes. Remember always the authenticity for your information is essentially depend the authenticity of your information depends upon the source of that information. So always make sure to quote or attribute some information, assuming that suppose something is told, you should write who is telling that. Only in a rare situation, sources who give you information impose a condition. Don't tell my name. We call it reliable sources. Well, reliable sources, journalists can quote reliable sources. And that is essentially to protect your sources. You have to protect your sources. Otherwise, tomorrow the source will not give you information. One of the basic principles of journalism is protecting sources. So that is true, but the point is it cannot be misused to the extent of writing your own version and telling reliable sources said. I have seen several journalists writing their version, what they think, but simply for the sake of authenticity, mention that the reliable sources revealed. The reliable sources told this correspondent. The TRS sources told this correspondent. Speaking to this correspondent, the BJP sources said. Nobody knows who is the TRS source, who is that BJP source. He is the own source of his own information. So often use this facility journalism provides you to write something which is essentially not gathered but created. So never do that. So authenticity, unless and until it is very, very essential to protect the source, unless and until it is very, very essential not to reveal the source, always your news stories should attribute it to someone. It should quote some sources. So attribution, quotes, bring authenticity to your source. Sixth one is continuously update your information. So whenever you are writing news, suppose especially when you are writing news for a print, suppose you file a story at 6 p.m. So your job doesn't end there. I have seen several reporters filing a story at 6 p.m. and forgetting that their duty, that their job is, and simply believing that their job is over. They simply forget the story. They don't bother what happened to that story later. So journalist's job is not 6-hour job, it's not 8-hour job alone. He is responsible for the story he or she filed. So that's a good journalist, is someone who continuously updates his story whether he is on the job or not, especially if it is a developing story, especially if it is an evolving story. So you should always update. You may add something. You may add new information. So till the deadline of the newspaper approaches you, you should continuously update. Normally the desk calls up the reporter and says, any update? So, but the reporter should proactively update his or her story. So he should be on the job. He cannot say, my duty is over, so I don't know what happened to that. Let someone else take up the responsibility. Because someone else cannot take up your responsibility because it is your story. It is your source. It is your beat. It is your information. Somebody may do it, but it is extremely difficult for that someone to get the additional information. It's easy for you to get the additional information. If somebody adds something to the story, the very essence of the story may also change. There may be variation in what you write and what someone writes. So always make it a point, update your story till the deadline. If it is a television news bulletin, till the next bulletin. Sometimes you might have filed a story for a TV. If you are a TV journalist, you might have filed a story and the story is edited and ready for telecast. And if some update is there, you have to inform the shift in charge, the news editor, that there is an update. So let me give you a phone in, or let me add something as a breaking news. So this attitude of constantly updating the story should be embedded into your journalistic activity. So you should always do that. Then the seventh one is, story cannot be too long. Journalism demands that the story should be as brief as possible. It should be as brief as possible and as long as possible, as brief as possible to attract the attention, to make as brief as possible to make it readable, and as long as possible to cover the details. So there should be a balance between the need to be brief and need to cover as many details as possible. So therefore, brevity is a fundamental principle of news writing. So you can't write a lengthy stories. In the age of internet journalism, in the age of television journalism, nobody is ready to read lengthy stories unless long story journalism is the policy. You have a magazine called Caravan, which believes in long form journalism. Its approach itself is long form journalism. There are articles which run into 10 pages, 12 pages also. There are readers consciously read Caravan. I read Caravan because I want to get some knowledge about something. So that is a different approach. They are conscious readers. So you can afford to be very lengthy. But normally in a journalism, in newspapers, you can't write a lengthy story. So therefore, it should be as brief as possible. Eighth one is, news should always be written in a particular form. Not always, at least when you are writing news, but especially when you are writing news, when you are filing news updates, the format is called inverted pyramid. Inverted pyramid essentially means the most important facts will be at the top and the other facts will be in a descending order of priority. So at the top you have the most important fact, at the bottom you have the least important facts. Why do you need to write in this format? Because you file a 400-word story. Assuming that you file a 400-word story. Late in the evening, some other important story has come. Your story is also equally important, but relatively that's more important. So your story has to be cut down, has to be reduced. So a sub-editor doesn't have time to rewrite the entire 400-word story into a 300-word story or a 200-word story. And you have already gone. You're not in the office. And there's no time to rewrite. So if you write in an inverted pyramid style with most important aspects of information at the top and the less important at the bottom, the sub-editor will have the comfort. So you can simply cut down the last para without losing the basic facts of the story. Otherwise, what will happen is the basic facts of the story come at the bottom and the sub-editor deletes the last paragraph. The basic facts of the story will go. So, but inverted pyramid need not necessarily be the only form of news writing. As I told you, the things are changing. Things are changing. Therefore, it is also one important format of writing. Sometimes the interest in the story has to be retained, has to be suspended. So there are different forms, especially when you're writing featurist news stories. You don't arrange the facts in such a mechanical manner. So there are changes, I do agree, but still inverted pyramid can be the basic style of writing. But the journalism has many more advanced forms of news writing. So the ninth one is, do not write anything if you are not clear about it. Don't use abbreviations. Don't use jargon. Don't use phrases which a reader doesn't understand. Quite often, but that doesn't mean you always explain the jargon. So especially when you're writing, when you have attended a press conference of finance minister, assuming the finance minister in her press conference says, well, due to the pandemic-induced economic crisis, sticking to the FRBM Act may not be possible. So you do not know what is FRBM. You simply heard finance minister telling, and you come and file a story. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman said here today that the pandemic-induced economic crisis makes it difficult for the governments to adhere to the FRBM Act. You do not know the FRBM. You have simply transferred your confusion to the reader. So reader may or may not know what the FRBM means. So your ignorance will be multiplied. Your ignorance will be transferred. Never do that. Get the clarity. Clarity of what you are writing is an important element of news writing. When you read news, so you will have to understand what is written in that news. A reader is not an expert. Believe always, reader is not an expert. Well, certain words after extensive coverage may become common thing. For example, you are writing about serological survey. Initially, when the sero surveys were released, the newspaper were writing, what do you mean by sero survey? How is it carried out? But over a period of time, there were repeated news referring to the serological survey, which does not give data about the existing, the new daily new cases, but it only gives you about the prevalence of infection. So you have to choose how to give the clarity to your news story. 10th one is always check whether your story attracts any legal complications. So your story should not land you in legal complication. This is not to scare you. You have to stand by what you write. I still remember we have published a story on child labor practice in the Hyderabad Metro. When Hyderabad Metro during the construction stage, we got news that child labor is being employed. Well, I am not sure whether it is L&T directly employing or some contractor employing. But the fact remains that child labor was employed. So we published a story. I as an editor got a legal notice from the L&T because the international financiers or investors took this very seriously, because this is an age of web. Even a unpopular newspaper also will be read by someone who matters. So the L&T sent me a legal notice. So asking me to apologize or else face the legal action. So I checked whether it is true. And my sources told that it's true. So I stood by my story. I stood by my reporter and written to the L&T, the PR agency which has written to me on behalf of the L&T, that I stand by my story. I will not apologize. And if you do not withdraw your letter, I will have to further write another story. Nothing happened. I'll give you another example. We have written a story on the 108 GVK group running the 108. So we wrote a story, GVK going Satyam way. So the story tells about the discrepancies in the official information about the number of employees, number of 108 ambulances run, and the salaries which they are paying, because government was reimbursing a significant proportion of that expenditure. So we got information that this data is inflated, number of employees, number of ambulances, and even the salaries. So we published the story, and I got a legal notice from the GVK group. So I stood by my story because I have checked the facts, veracity of the facts, even before publishing the story. We had even the salary slips and official communication between GVK and the government. And we have evidence of a discrepancy. So I stood by my story, and nothing happened to me. So it is not to scare, but you should be very, very careful about the possible legal implications. But this may not happen in every story. You go for a press conference and you file a story, nothing will happen. But always remember, whether there will be a legal complication or not, whether there will be a legal implication or not, you should be honest in reporting facts. You should be honest in gathering facts. You should be honest in presentation of the facts. So these are the 10 important dimensions of a news story. So dimensions of news writing, elements of news writing. Well, we will discuss more in my next video lectures.